Good afternoon. As we wait for people to connect, I want to thank you for joining us for this timely discussion of the humanitarian relief efforts in Gaza after the ceasefire. I'm Brian Romick, and I'm President and CEO of Democratic Majority for Israel. I'm proud to be building on DMFI's strong foundation and expanding its impact on Capitol Hill and support for pro-Israel Democrats across the country. As the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas continues to hold, we're grateful to be joined today by IsraAID Global CEO Yotam Polizer to discuss the relief efforts in Gaza, including IsraAID's work to develop long-term recovery programs in education and mental health, to design a new mechanism for aid distribution with international coalition, and provide life-saving medical and nutritional support for women and children. Before we get started, a reminder, please consider following us on social media. We're on X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky. You can sign up for our news and updates on our website, dmfi.org. If you want to ask a question, submit it through the Q&A feature on your Zoom interface. If you're watching on Facebook, you can enter it in the comments section. Now, I'm very pleased to turn it over to DMFI's founding board co-chair, Ann Lewis, to introduce today's distinguished guest.
Thank you, Brian. And I'm honored to introduce one of my personal heroes. As you've heard, Yotam Polizer is the global CEO of IsraAID, Israel's largest humanitarian aid organization. IsraAID is known around the world for its work in disaster zones. Yotam has led crisis response and long-term recovery efforts in over 60 countries, reaching millions of victims. Now its work is also closer to home. Since the Hamas attacks, October 7th, 2023, for the first time in its history, IsraAID has provided emergency services at home in Israel. And since early 2024, in constant coordination with Israeli officials, IsraAID has been working with international and local partners to secure critically needed aid for Gaza civilians. We could have no better guide for what is happening on the ground. Yotam, welcome back, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thanks for having me again. Thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for joining. And a good night from Tel Aviv. But I'm very grateful to be here with all of you, and I think it's a very important moment in time. But maybe before I dive into the current situation in Gaza and touch both on the challenges and the opportunities, there are many challenges and there are many opportunities. Maybe I'll start with just a quick intro for IsraAID, for maybe those of you who are not so familiar with the organization. So IsraAID is a non-governmental, non-political organization. We were established 25 years ago, and our goal was sort of to be the humanitarian wing of the startup nation. Our goal was to bring aid from Israel to the world's most vulnerable communities, and we've done it in 65 countries. The latest country we responded was Jamaica, following the hurricane 2 weeks ago. So we are not only first in, we are not, I think what people know about us that we are these Michigan Israelis jumping on planes whenever there's a crisis. So yes, it's true, it's part of who we are. And we typically arrive within the first 72 hours after a crisis, even if it's in the other side of the world, in place like Jamaica or Haiti or other remote areas. But more importantly, we actually stay. We actually stay long after the media and the cameras move on, for as long as we're needed to help community recover and rebuild. And just as an example, we have been working for 14 years in South Sudan, supporting survivors of rape and sexual-based violence. I personally had led 12 humanitarian missions around the world. I started my humanitarian career after the tsunami in Fukushima in 2011. That's when I joined IsraAID, and since then, I've led our missions in Sierra Leone during the Ebola outbreak, which was terrifying experience, but that's a whole different webinar. In Nepal, after the earthquake, where our team was actually able to find the last survivor, a woman who survived for 6 days without food or water. I also worked a lot with Syrian refugees, which was actually the first time we worked with people who were considered our enemies. And there's a story that I always share about how we rescued a Syrian girl. Her father came to me and told me, my worst enemy became my biggest supporter, and the people who are supposed to protect me back home in Syria are chasing me away. And I'm mentioning that because we are now working in Gaza, but long before working in Gaza, we actually worked with our other neighbors in Syria. And the last mission that I personally led was in the summer of 2021, 4 years ago, after the fall of Kabul. Uh, Together with incredible group of Israeli women, we started a rescue operation from Afghanistan, and we ended up pulling out 205 girls and former Afghan diplomats from the hands of the Taliban. And this is, again, another conversation for another webinar. But I will just say that in the peak of this operation, we actually had to print passports for these girls, got it across the border. And when we needed a country to take them, we reached out our new best buddies in the Middle East, who are, of course, the United Arab Emirates. So when the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, when he heard there was a group of Israeli rescuing Afghan girls, he immediately said, bring them over. And that was sort of the first humanitarian mission of the Abraham Accords. But we never worked in Israel. And then on October 7th of 2023, everything changed. And we launched a massive response to support survivors of the massacre. We ended up operating 16 evacuation sites for people from Kibbutz Be'eri, from Kibbutz Nir Oz, from Kibbutz Nachal Oz. We provided them with trauma counseling, educational programs. We also provided mental health support for 1,200 Nova survivors. And we did something I never thought we would do in a place like Israel. We ended up building 62 bomb shelters for the Bedouin communities in the Negev. And I don't know how much you remember, but the first girl who was severely injured by the Iranian attacks was actually a Bedouin Muslim Israeli girl who didn't have a bomb shelter. So that's our work in Israel. And right now in Israel, our main focus area is actually the long-term recovery and rehabilitation of hostages and their families through a new initiative that's called 255. But the topic of our conversation is Gaza. So in Gaza, quite frankly, and I shared it before, I didn't think we can make an impact. We're called IsraAID. I didn't think we can actually help. But I realized that our Israeli identity and our unique DNA of being both Israeli and humanitarian is actually a key. And in early 2024, we started to receive requests from many humanitarian partners who were struggling to bring in aid into Gaza. At the same time, we also received similar requests from COGAT. COGAT is the IDF unit that is in charge of everything going into Gaza, all the civilian humanitarian goods. And we started a logistics hub to coordinate and facilitate aid into Gaza, to make sure that it's all the humanitarian supplies and the humanitarian professionals who are delivering this aid are vetted and approved by Israel, and they're not affiliated with Hamas. And by doing so, we were able to dramatically minimize the risk for diversion. It was a very complicated effort, and but I can say proudly that in the last year and a half since we started this operation in Gaza, we were able to support about 270,000 people in Gaza through medical support, with water desalination system that provide access to clean water, through hygiene kits, and through nutritional supplements for children who are suffering from severe malnutrition. We kept this effort very quiet until last July, basically 2025, when I think was the lowest point, both from a humanitarian perspective, but also in terms of everyone was playing the blame game. And we realized that we have to speak out. We of course didn't expose the names of our partners on the ground because we wanted to protect them, but we wanted to tell people that the only way forward is if we all work on this together. And we need all hands on deck. And Israel, and especially Israel's civil society organization like IsraAID, should be part of the solution and not just be seen as part of the problem. So I spoke out at the Dan Senior podcast, and then on CNN and Fox and other many media channels. And it was actually very heartwarming to see that there was a lot of positive responses. and many people in the Jewish community and beyond were looking for a way to support the civilian population in Gaza. And when we stepped up our efforts, they joined us. And again, that's how we were able to reach more than 10% of the population in Gaza with direct relief. So that's sort of the background. And now I'll get to where we are today. So I'll start with the good news. Even before the ceasefire, actually from early August, we have seen a dramatic improvement of the humanitarian situation on the ground. More aid was coming in. In fact, the average amount of trucks, and that's not the only way to measure humanitarian aid, but it's one measurement. The average amount of trucks going into Gaza right now is more than the average trucks that came in before October 7th. So much more food is coming in. We have seen if in early July, which was really the lowest point from humanitarian perspective, when the price of rice, 1 kg, which is about 2 pounds of rice in the markets in Gaza, was $120, the prices dropped more than 90% now. So Gaza is, well, almost, I'm saying almost because there's still a huge gap in need, flooded with food. Now, we have to remember that that's not enough, because even if there's enough rice or flour, when kids especially or other vulnerable communities are suffering from severe malnutrition, just bread and rice will not do it. You need nutritional supplements, you need vitamins, you need vegetables. So that's a big part of our effort now together with different partners. So that's the good news. There's much more aid coming in. Of course, after the ceasefire and the incredible release of the hostages, which was a miracle that I think none of us on this call still believe it actually happened, there are still many gaps and needs. The most urgent humanitarian need right now is related to the winter. We just had, a few days ago, we had a small storm, but lots of rain in Israel and in Gaza, and there's a huge need for shelter and tents and tarps and shelter items. So that's a huge effort from our side and from other humanitarian partners. Of course, the biggest concern when it comes to Gaza is what comes next. And I know everyone on this call are following the news and, following yesterday's resolution by the Security Council. I think there's a lot of hope in the region that we will see progress in terms of the transitional government, in terms of disarmament of Hamas, but we still have a long way to go. And so the question is what happens in the meantime and how we can continue provide the urgently needed humanitarian aid and support trusted partners, and by doing so, also build the civil society infrastructure that will provide and lead the long-term recovery efforts. So I guess I'll stop here, maybe just with one last story before we open it up. A lot of people, of course, ask me, how can you support Gaza? How can you make sure it's not reaching Hamas? And my answer is that actually, because of our unique identity, because we understand Israel's security concerns, we are uniquely positioned to work with both the IDF and vetted partners to minimize the risk of the aid going to Hamas. But I was concerned because, as I shared before, we are working with people who suffered the worst atrocities on October 7th. So I actually went and spoke to every leader of every kibbutz and told them we are doing this work in Gaza. And I have to tell you, I received the most heartwarming responses. In fact, one of the leaders of one of these kibbutzim told me that the fact that we are operating in Gaza is the most hopeful thing she heard since October 7th. Because she said, Israel actually cares about our security and safety. So if you are there to coordinate the aid and to make sure it actually reaches the people who need it the most, it makes me feel safer and it helps me go back to my home in southern Israel. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, Yotam. That was really moving. And it's so good to hear that there's been a really increase in improvement and distribution since the ceasefire took hold. I'm pleased to moderate the Q&A session, and if folks have a question, please put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on social media, you can put it into the comment section. And Yotam, I'll kick it off.
Sure.
As you said, things are improving since the ceasefire in terms of the distribution, but we're not. It's not making news. We're not seeing headlines accordingly. So is there a publicity problem, or why do you think it's breaking through?
Well, I'm sure most of the people on this call will appreciate when there's no news around Israel, it's usually good news. I mean, I've been in this for so long, and a lot of people are asking me, how don't we hear about your efforts? And unfortunately, by the way, it's not just with the media obsession about Israel. I think it's part of it, but it's also how social media works, right? The algorithm loves the controversies, the conspiracy theories, not so much when things are working better. Now, that's not to say that everything is working smoothly. There are still huge humanitarian gaps and needs, and there are still a lot of uncertainties about this current plan in Gaza. And I believe people on this call watched the horrific videos of Hamas slaughtering their own people. I mean, the Palestinians
Mhm.
who allegedly were, collaborating with Israel right after they took over. So I think that's obviously a huge concern. And that's why the situation is still very far from being stable. But purely from a humanitarian perspective, and even more specifically in terms of the food security, which was obviously a huge concern for everyone, ourselves included, we are in a much better situation now.
That's really good to hear. And it was quite chilling, the videos of Hamas coming out of the tunnels and attacking political rivals. I have a couple questions for you. For Audrey's interested to know about the role, if any role, that UNRWA is playing. And then Kenneth is interested to know if the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which we had heard much about pre-ceasefires, is still involved in distribution efforts.
Yeah, so interestingly, both UNRWA and the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation are not as active as before. UNRWA, for different reasons, obviously. So UNRWA has been defunded by the U.S. administration, not even during the Biden administration. So not that's not a recent thing, and they lost a lot of their funding. And then about a year ago, I think it was January, but don't catch me on the dates. There was the law that passed that basically um, stopped UNRWA from operating in Israel,
Mhm.
which meant that practically they can't really bring in aid on behalf of UNRWA. So they are still operating within Gaza, but on a much smaller capacity. And so they're still in existence in Gaza, but their role is much smaller. Other UN agencies like UNICEF and World Food Program are taking a much bigger role right now in aid distribution. Um, UNRWA played two roles pre October 7. One was the distribution of humanitarian aid, and the other one is education. So obviously, until now, the education role was well, it was very important before the war, but during the war, there was very little educational facilities operating in Gaza. So I think now a big question will be to see what future education will Gaza look like. I can share confidentially that we are actually involved in a new exciting effort together that's called the Gaza Children Village. That's already operating 7 orphanages in Gaza. And the goal is to give them education, to give them child protection, and also build a different future for these children. So we'll see how that goes. But this is a new effort, and obviously we'll have to see what role, if any, UNRWA will take. About the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, currently they are not operating, basically since the ceasefire, because some of the sites where they distributed the aid are out of the what we call the yellow line. Um, they are they're stopped their operations, we are hearing different discussions, and I cannot confirm this formally, about a new plan, a new aid distribution plan. I don't think it will be exactly the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, but maybe with some similar elements. Um, so it's a good question. I will say about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, we were not part of this mechanism, but we have met with them as we met with everyone, and we try to, again, enable more aid into Gaza. That in the last few weeks of their operation was actually working better. I mean, they were actually able to deliver aid directly to a lot of women and children, really in the last few weeks when the GHF was operating. So we'll have to see going forward if and how they will be part of the humanitarian mechanism. Currently, they're not operating.
Thanks, Yotam. Another question from Lisa. In light of Hamas's failure to disarm, what do you see as chances of moving to a day after scenario in which the situation in Gaza can normalize on humanitarian and a civil society basis, not to mention rebuilding? Are
Yeah.
Qatar and Turkey playing a role on the humanitarian front?
Look, I'm not a political analyst, and even if I was, I don't think I would have a good answer for this one, honestly. Thankfully, my role is focused on humanitarian aid and, you know, more specifically, helping people, provide them with life-saving assistance. But I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know, and it's obviously the not million, not billion, trillion or gazillion dollar question. I am optimistic a little bit. I'm cautiously optimistic because I see a lot of efforts, not just by the administration, but also by international partners. I mean, we are in close contact with the UAE, and I know there's a lot of discussion about the role that they will be maybe taking in this. Um, Obviously, the biggest question here is, one, how and who will be in this transitional government? And I know that's being discussed as we speak, and it's not being finalized. And second, the role of the security forces and what mandate they will actually have. And we had bad experience from Lebanon, from Hezbollah for many years with UN security forces that was not able to stop Hezbollah from, um, receiving much more arms and weapons. So obviously there's a huge concern here. Um, but again, at least I take comfort in the fact that I think it's a big focus. There's a concentrated effort, especially on that right now. So I hope we'll see some good news and progress on this in the next few weeks.
Thanks, Yotam. Do you have a sense in terms of numbers of how many trucks may be getting into Gaza a day? At one point, I think there was
Yeah,
maybe 600 plus.
it's approximately 600 a day
Okay,
in average.
okay.
Some days less, some days more, but 600, which is again more than the trucks that came in before October 7th. Now, before October 7th, we had about 520, 30 per day. Now it's 600. Now, this 600, just to clarify, it's not all aid. A lot of it is actually delivered by private sector, which is also very important because it hints that there is a beginning of economic life in Gaza. Will take a long time, but that's important to kind of clarify.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful to know. And we have a question from Michael who wonders what are reliable sources on, for one who wants to learn about the humanitarian relief efforts in Gaza. What would you recommend? Well, certainly will follow you on social media and whatnot, but what
Yeah,
else should we read?
look, it's a great question because, when I came out with this story, and we were, again, really concerned to do it, but we really felt that everyone, really everyone on all sides were playing the blame game. And it was very hard to find kind of credible sources. I can share some interesting insights, I mean, I think everyone knows about the complicated and toxic relations between Israel and the UN. I can share that, for example, with UNICEF, who is, one of the largest humanitarian aid agency from the UN who are focusing on children and specifically malnourished children. We have seen a lot of progress, and so I saw just in the last few weeks a lot of like good good information on media and social media coming from UNICEF or coming from the IDF about UNICEF efforts. And I can share, and this is public information. We just received a big grant from UNICEF to support children in Israel who have been traumatized. And this is kind of historic because UNICEF never, to the best of my knowledge, they never worked with children in Israel, and now they're doing it through IsraAID. And we've been partnering with them in Gaza and in many other parts of the world. So again, I do think that there's there's credibility there. I do think that the work that World Central Kitchen is doing, again, one of our main partners, is very important, and also they have a unique ability to recognize the pain on both sides. Jose Andreas, the chef from World Central Kitchen, I hosted him in Israel. We sat for a few hours with President Herzog and with other government officials. I mean, he went into Gaza at the peak of the war, and I saw a lot of suffering there, obviously. And 2 hours later, he went out and he met the returned hostages. So really his ability to see the pain on both sides. And World Central Kitchen is probably the only organization except IsraAID who are actually working still also in Israel, providing food for people in northern Israel, and of course in Gaza, and they're now ramping up their efforts. So I do think, again, they have a lot of credibility. In terms of news sources, I mean, I think it's really about picking um, both sides, and the truth is usually in the middle. What I tell people, if I need to summarize, in 2 sentences, the situation in Gaza, I always say there is actually a humanitarian crisis. That's not fake news. But the only way forward is for Israel to be part of the solution and not just be seen as part of the problem, and for everyone to work on this together. And so, I mean, these two truths can hold. I am extremely careful with anything that's like terms that are scientific, like famine and others, and I don't see clear evidence for. We have seen severe malnutrition in pockets of Gaza, but widespread famine, or of course, even worse, accusations, as we heard, are not something that we witnessed.
Thank you. That's clarifying. Tom, what is your assessment of how the Israeli government has approached the work you're doing and the need to surge aid into Gaza?
Um, Look, I think again, our approach is to be extremely pragmatic, um, which means we want to make sure we can do our work, and we want to make sure civilians receive the aid they need, and we worked very closely with the IDF, and we worked very closely with some people in the government. Again, it's not our role to compliment or criticize them.
Mhm.
But again, I do think that there's that after we reached a very low point, and when partially the declared policy of the government for a few months was that no aid was coming in, we worked very hard quietly to advocate for more aid, and for parallel mechanism, not just GHF but also other aid organization. And I was happy to see that, partially thanks to our effort, but also not just us. It was a big group effort. Um, the policy changed, so we have seen an improvement in the situation. Um, there's definitely a room for more.
Thank you. We've a couple people wrote in wondering about the security of IsraAID workers. Is there anything you can speak to in terms
Yeah, sure. I
of?
mean, so Israel, my own team are bringing the aid to the crossing. They're not working in Gaza. We are working with trusted and vetted partners. Most of them are international organizations with Palestinian staff. So the Palestinian staff who are working and delivering the supplies that we bring are obviously at a high risk. And that's why we cannot expose their identity, and we cannot put our logos on anything that comes into Gaza. I mean, the local partners on the ground know very well where this aid is coming from, and they're extremely appreciative of this. Um, we are in daily contact with many of them, online mostly. So it's complex and risky, but at the same time, I think we have a security team in-house that's kind of taking all the extra measures to make sure we keep all of our partners safe.
It's good to know. You talked a little bit about the changing weather as we enter the winter season and whatnot, and how that affects and impacts some of the services you all help with. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's the third winter in Gaza since the war started, so it's not a new challenge. But the last year has been, in terms of the how severe the situation is and how desperate and the lack of shelter for so many people internally displaced in Gaza has been kind of really horrific. And so we just get to this very extremely challenging point where you have more than half of the population without a proper shelter. And I mean, again, everyone saw the images from Gaza, so the level of devastation is for the physical infrastructure, severe. So you can imagine that when there is a small rain, it all becomes like one big um, swamp, I guess, and it's the living conditions are extremely difficult, and that's obviously a recipe for spread of disease and other public health issues and concerns. So it's not just about tent and shelter, which is obviously a big need. It's also about how you prevent the spread of diseases and how you help people with their basic sanitation and hygiene. So I would say if people would ask him what is the biggest need right now in Gaza, one is shelter, second is hygiene and sanitation, much more than food, to be honest.
During the war, we read stories and we saw that some of the aid was being diverted by terrorist groups or other militias. Is there any of that sort of corruption ongoing? And is that maybe just part of what you all need to deal with as aid relief workers in this situation?
Look, the looting that we saw, the looting and the diversion, and again, I'm sure all of us saw these different videos of people taking over trucks and aid in general. We can divide this looting in two categories. One was really just desperate people who were like usually in the hundreds and sometimes in the thousands, just grabbing whatever they can. And that we saw a lot of that um, when there was aid scarcity, when there was more restrictions on aid, and and that was, looting for really for because of desperation, and was mainly done by people who were just so desperate to grab whatever they can. So we don't call it looting, we actually call it self-distribution. It's not the best way to deliver aid because you want to make sure aid distributes equally and aid reaches the most vulnerable. But at least it was really mainly because of that level of desperation. Now, the second part of the looting, which is much more problematic, is done by armed terror groups, including Hamas. And we have seen that too, of course. And we've seen more of that when there was aid scarcity, because we do believe, and it's not just us, we heard it from people in the IDF and also people in the government, that when there was a financial incentive to loot, um, when the resale value for every truck that was looted was so high, we saw much more of armed looting. So when Gaza was essentially flooded with aid, we see a lot less looting. It's an issue of supply and
Mhm.
demand. And we've seen how the prices in the market dropped dramatically. So right now, according to all the data that we have from multiple partners, including with the IDF, we see a lot less looting. Now, we don't know. I mean, I think, we know that the people that we are working with and distributing, because we vet each and every one of them, and they are vetted also by the Israeli security authorities, that there's no affiliation with Hamas. But, there are other organizations that we are not working with. So obviously there is a concern that some of the aid is reaching Hamas, or that Hamas is benefiting by taxing some of it. So to say that right now there is absolutely no diversion will be something that, of course, we cannot say. We can say that the aid efforts that we're involved at, the risk for diversion is a lot smaller.
Thank you. Maybe a couple questions on your work outside of Gaza over the years. You mentioned earlier that you had just done some hurricane relief work in Jamaica. You had mentioned you had done some work in Sudan. Could you tell us about the experience in Jamaica and what's the process for, there's so much need in the world. What's the sort of
Yep.
process you all go through about where to go and how you can make an impact?
Sure. So, I mean, that's more of our bread and butter, actually. Gaza and Israel are the unique cases. The work we're doing in Jamaica is what we've been doing for 25 years. And we have an emergency response team in Israel. So whenever there's a crisis somewhere in the world, we do a very quick, rapid assessment. And then we typically send a small team, not 100 people, just about between 5 to 8 people, which includes usually medical professionals, trauma specialists, water engineers, logisticians, and team leaders. And our advantage is actually that we're small because we're very flexible. And I think it's a very Israeli thing that we're kind of jumping on plane. We always arrive first, but also, when we get to these airports in Jamaica was no difference. That's what I heard from the team. We see huge organization, UN and other entities stuck in costumes, and we're like good Israelis passing them from the side and are able to arrive to the most affected area. And so we have our emergency response team. They will usually arrive, and when they arrive, they do two things. One is deliver immediate aid, but more importantly, we are always looking for local partners that we can work with that are actually interested in the type of expertise that we can bring from Israel, whether it's water technology, whether it's public health, search and rescue. It's really case by case. Um, and we will only work in places where we can bring an added value, because there are things that we can do and the things that we can't do. And I think we have this expertise in Israel, not because everything is perfect in Israel. I think it's because of the challenges, whether it's water scarcity, the ongoing conflict, the trauma of the Holocaust. We developed expertise that could and should be shared with the world's most vulnerable community. So that's how we usually operate. We can't operate everywhere, so of course we also need funding. So we can only operate when we have some funds. We have an emergency fund that enables us to prioritize our efforts. And I will also say that at any given moment, we cannot be in more than 15 countries in our current capacity. So we have 450 full-time staff around the world right now. The big majority of them, by the way, are not Israeli or Jewish. They're locals that we trained and supported, and they are the ones on the ground doing this work. And that's how we were able also to continue this work during our darkest hour in Israel, because while we were at war, our local teams were able to continue in Ukraine, in South Sudan, in Jamaica, and elsewhere. An average project for us will be 5 years, but in some cases, like I mentioned in South Sudan, where there is an ongoing conflict, we stayed for 14 years. So first we will provide relief, then we'll identify local partner, we'll train, we'll support, we'll mentor, and then we'll phase out.
Thank you, Yotam. And I think this will be the final question, but has the U.S. its decision to sort of defund USAID, for example, increased demand for IsraAID globally?
Increase demand and increase the challenges. Yes, I mean it's been very challenging time for the whole sector. We received little funding from USAID, so we lost little funding, thankfully. Although we were about to receive much bigger funding that was not, unfortunately, we didn't receive it, but thankfully I didn't have to let go of anyone, similar to many other organizations in Washington. Um, the sector has been really suffering, not just by USAID cuts, but also other governments. I mean, USAID was the most significant one because it was by far the largest one. So yeah, we have seen in many places like Ukraine or South Sudan or Colombia, we saw how overnight organizations just closed their shop, and the needs and the demand was much higher. I know a lot of people in Washington suffered from this, But I can tell you that in the global south where we work, it's like literally people lost their lives because of these dramatic changes.
It's tragic. Yotam, thank you to you and IsraAID and for all the work you are doing, and thank you for spending time with us today. I'm very pleased now to turn it over to our board member, Peter Villegas, who is joining us from the West Coast. Peter.
Thank you, Rachel. Yotam, thank you so much for spending time out of your busy day and schedule to be with us. So impressive of what you do in IsraAID all over the world, and the things that you're doing to improve the lives of innocent Palestinians in Gaza. And we thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. To everyone else on the call, this is a critical time for Israel and for the stability in the region. Yesterday, the United Nations reached a major breakthrough as the 15-member Security Council voted in favor of a U.S. resolution endorsing the 20-point peace plan, including the disarmament of Hamas and other armed factions and the creation of an international stabilization force and the rebuilding of Gaza. There's a lot of questions that need to be answered and hurdles to overcome, but this is an important step in ensuring the ceasefire remains in place and for improving Israel's long-term security. This moment is also a critical time to strengthen and grow support for the U.S.-Israel relationship within the Democratic Party. As the home for pro-Israel Democrats, and with your help, DMFI is uniquely positioned to lead this effort. So your support for DMFI helps us to continue the public briefings, the education on the Hill, to the staff and to the members themselves, and to get out the pro-Israel messaging to Capitol Hill and to the public. So please go to the QR code on your screen or our website and make sure you can give your year-end gift to DMFI today. Thank you again, Yotam. Thank everybody for joining us. Happy Thanksgiving.